Western civilization. How much do you know? My name is Russell Miles, and this is the 20th episode of our Western Civilization series. In this episode, we'll look at mental illness. This is a grand story and will illustrate the complex ways of health science in Western culture. This is also a sad story. My own family experienced much mental illness. I hope this episode will be encouraging to those listening with their own experiences. And he was asking him, "What is your name?" And he said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he began to implore him earnestly not to send him out of the country. Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. The demons implored him, saying, "Send us into the swine so that we may enter them." Jesus gave them permission. And coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep banks into the sea, and 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. The Gospel of Mark 5:9-13. This biblical scene has been interpreted as a man experienced schizophrenia and compelled to live in a village graveyard due to others' fears. Jesus' compassion and calming demeanour gives the man hope, which is part of the modern mental health practices. The assigning mental illness to demons has also been a long-term facet in Western culture. It is still common to suggest mentally ill persons are dangerous. Throughout human history, the mentally ill were mostly cared for by family, if at all, often confined. In less developed places in the world where modern pharmaceuticals are expensive and access to treatment prohibited, restraints and confinement are still commonplace. In the past, wealthy families might seek that deranged relatives be placed in the care of religious orders. In 1403, Bethlehem Hospital was established in London to care for the insane. Madness can also be observed in literature. Hamlet. Hey Mary, why was he sent to England? Gravedigger. Why? Because he was mad. He shall recover his wits there, or if he do not, it is no great matter. Why? Till they not be seen in there. There the men are as mad as he. How came he mad? Very strangely, they say. How strangely? Faith, he was losing his wits. Upon what ground? Why, here in Denmark. David McClure, in his biography of the distinguished United States politician John Adams, whom we have mentioned a number of times in this series, said, "In the warm seasons he relished long walks and time alone on horseback. Such exercise, he believed, roused the animal spirits and dispensed the melancholy. He loved the open meadows of the home and the old acquaintances of rock ledges and breezes from the sea. From his doorstep to the water's edge was approximately a mile." Mental illness has long been the subject of medical inquiry. Dr. Benjamin Rush was one of the co-signers of the American Declaration of Independence. In 1812 he published Medical Inquiries and Observations upon the Disease of the Mind, one of the earliest textbooks on the subject. State-run institutions supplemented religious institutions from the Middle Ages. In 1793, at the time of revolutionary fervour in France, Dr. Philip Pinel was assigned to an asylum in the south of France. Dr. Pinel noticed that mental patients had been unshackled and cared for each other and were working about the asylum. The governor, Jean-Baptiste, had removed the iron shackles, but sometimes using straitjackets. It may be that Dr. Pinel learnt of this practice after he left the asylum. However, he was to direct other patients be unchained, with the policy adopted throughout France. The one-time Hudson River State Hospital in New York State was sited around the river so that inmates arriving there literally went round the bend. There is a similar story about the old Yarra Bend Lunatic Asylum in Melbourne, which closed in 1925. Round the bend is also a naval slang for mad or insane. Dorothea Dix, 1802 to 1887, was born in the United States and, as mentioned in previous episode, was an advocate on behalf of the mentally ill. She had an alcoholic father and grew up with a wealthy relative. She worked as a governess and later ran a private school. Through this work she met others interested in social reform. In 1841, Dorothea Dix conducted a statewide investigation of the care of the mentally ill in the US state of Massachusetts. Thomas Kirkbridge was a reformer of asylum care in the United States during the middle 1800s. He pursued the construction of buildings that were pleasing to the eye, surrounded by gardens and farmyards, with single rooms and where patients enjoyed a quiet environment. This was referred to as the Kirkbridge Plan. However, asylums quickly attracted those who were destitute, frail, or in need of care, but not necessarily ill. Patient populations skyrocketed, overfilling institutions as soon as they were complete, with standards of care declining. In the early 1900s, there was exploration with induced coma. It had been observed that some patients who experienced inadvertent coma from insulin showed improvement. Shock by immersion showers, cold baths, electric shock, or long-term sleep was experimented with to care the mentally ill. This continued to the mid-1950s, despite little evidence of improvement and much harm caused. Madness was seen as a disease of the brain, and like other organs, might be cured. Treatment included cutting out diseased parts and bleeding to reduce imagined pressures. The practice of neurological surgery or lobotomy, which involved permanently damaging parts of the brain's frontal lobe. This was found to reduce some severe symptoms, but also stupefied, in some cases cause death. The procedure was performed as follows. To induce sedation, inflict 2 quick shocks to the head. Roll back one of the patient's eyelids. Insert a device 2/3 the size of a pencil through the upper eyelid into the patient's head. Guided by the markings indicating death, tap the device with the hammer into the patient's head frontal lobe. After the appropriate depth is achieved, manipulate the device back and forth in a sweeping motion. Lobotomy is still utilised in very limited and specific circumstances. In the Australian state of Victoria, this requires independent assessment by a panel appointed by the state's chief psychiatrist. However, the procedure is illegal in other jurisdictions around the world. In the late 1800s, it was observed that medication used to treat some diseases also had a positive effect on mental stability. Opium had long been used as a sedative. In 1954, an antipsychotic drug called thiazarine for the treatment of the mentally ill was introduced. In rapid succession, other psychotic medication became available, making it possible to cut substantially the length of times patients stayed in mental institutions and able to return home and live in the community. In the early 1900s, the Viennese physician Sigmund Freud proposed that the mind had a structure of itself, separate from the brain. He proposed that talk therapy to deal with adverse responses to trauma and developmental concerns. Freud's idea was later found to be very relevant, as the brain's physical structure of neuron connections, entailing almost 100 billion neurons with hundreds of connections each, which are analog or graduated, creating in excess of 60 trillion neuron connections. This is the hardware, with the pathways of connections that change and develop with stimulus or experience being the structure of the mind, and can be likened to the software of a computer, only far more elaborate than any machine we might conceive. Soldier's heart is a condition described as caused by prolonged exposure to battle and harsh circumstances was documented during the US Civil War. In the Great War, shell shock, psychological responses such as blindness and paralysis, was initially thought to be caused by exploding shells causing sudden air compression and that left no direct injury. There was later awareness that the nature of treatment could worsen symptoms. Soldiers recovered quicker if treated close to the front line, given rest, and kept subject to military discipline. The widespread adoption of Freud's talk therapy was instrumental in helping mental health patients. A British Army psychiatrist during the Great War, Dr. W. Rivers, and who worked at Cochlear Heart Hospital, was one of those who adopted the new approach, and is ably described in Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy. Sailors in battle almost never experience psychological breakdown. This is as opposed to when sailors are on shore leave or away from their ship, where they psychologically break down and become ill-disciplined at the same rate as other young men in military service. Whereas soldiers and airmen often experience mental collapse. During the Second World War, the US Army documented that if a soldier had not been killed or maimed within 250 days of active service, they inevitably experienced a mental collapse. For pilots it was far less, 90 days. Why is it different from sailors and soldiers? The answer to the above conundrum is sailors work in close confined spaces, mostly within touching distance of one another. They draw emotional support from this environment. Moreover, they rarely need to make personal decisions to place themselves in extreme danger. The ship's captain makes these decisions, and in turn have a higher incidence of psychological breakdown. Whereas soldiers in battle are often in small groups seeking cover and may be unable to see any of their comrades, and when directed must move from any cover and expose themselves to harm. Aircrew are in an even more isolated position and must make an individual decision to close with the enemy. The understanding of the impact of support and perception on the outcome of psychological responses has informed much about modern care and treatment of the mentally ill. After the Second World War, demobilisation of soldiers and returning prisoners of war saw trials with patient-managed and community care. Although this experiment was abandoned after the majority of veterans were returned to the community, there was some legacy of patient participation in civilian institutions. Consider the novel and the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and the patient group therapy scenes. However, patient involvement in decisions about their care and treatment remains a paramount consideration. Definition: mentally ill person means a person owing to mental illness requires care and the treatment or control for their own good or the public interest and is for the time being incapable of managing their affairs. 1980s. In the 1980s, there were about 5,000 long-term mental health patients in the Australian state of Victoria. Population 4 million at the time. There was also a movement for those with mental illness and their families to assert more involvement in their own care and managing services. By 2000, in Victoria, there were approximately 90 patients confined for lengthy periods in forensic psychiatric hospital. A similar number of mentally ill were confined within other correctional facilities. There are also 1,200 short-term hospital beds in general hospitals, some of which were secure or locked wards, along with 250 in community residential care. There were approximately 26,000 persons who were secluded, confined in hospital in Victoria, most for only a number of hours, with 200,000 service contacts. Collaborative care or recovery model is a recognition that while the cure of mental illness may be problematic, with adequate support and a say about their care, those affected can remain with families, live independently and pursue productive lives. This includes housing, legal support, support for carers, respite programs, employment and education, and social stimulation. There are about 6,000 persons in Victoria receiving intensive community support, with about 100,000 who receive occasional support each year. Persons are considered to have a right to refuse treatment and may formally appeal any mandated care and treatment. However, the capacity of a person with significant mental health to assert their rights, application and the cost of civil war, the disparate power between professionals and consumers remains a significant issue. Those accused of criminal offences are often faced with a choice of accepting medical treatment or incarceration, thus not really a voluntary agreement. Criminal Code Act 1995 Australia, 7.3 Mental Impairment, Part 6. A person cannot rely on a mental impairment to deny voluntariness or the existence of a fault element, but may rely on this section to deny criminal responsibility. Social stigma for those experiencing mental illness in employment, education, at law, and in the community generally remains. As previously mentioned, when some heinous violent act is committed, it is often purported that the person must be mentally ill, whereas there is no significant evidence that those with mental illness are any more likely to commit harm towards themselves or to others in the community. There are, though, some very specific and unique mental illnesses where a person is more likely to commit harm to themselves and others. These cases, though, remain extremely rare. In Australia in the 1990s, there was a major initiative to prevent suicides. For men, this saw a reduction of 24 per 100,000 a year to 14 or 400 fewer deaths by 2020. The incidence of suicide for women and children continued to remain very low, at about 5 per 100,000. These initiatives stressed early intervention, expert medical assessment, patient involvement, community-based resources, restricting access to means of harm such as firearms, drugs and access to high places and railway lines and hanging points in jails. Other aspects were the recognition of promoting resilience in healthcare amongst the broader population. This has been an additional podcast in this series about the impact of disease on Western civilization. The others in this series have explored major pandemics that affected the West, the spread of disease in the age of exploration and colonisation, attitudes and religious interpretations, and the advent of cooperation and international agencies in the modern era.